Hello, this is your color correction instructor Taz Talley, and in this video I'd like to go over and review some digital image fundamentals about how color is created and then output, and also dive right into evaluating images based upon histograms. So let's get started. And what I'm going to do, like I always do when I'm working in Photoshop, I'm going to create a duplicate copy of this. So I'm just going to make this original image. I'm going to work with this lighthouse image. I'm going to make it smaller, and then I'm going to come underneath image, and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this my working version. I always name my images working versions because that lets me know just visually, even without opening up my image, hey, this is a .psd file, right? A native Photoshop file that I'm working with layers and masks and doing all my editing. And remember, the other reason I do this is it protects my original image and gives me an on-screen compare and contrast. But I always make my original one much smaller so I don't, by mistake, click on the wrong image and start editing it. All right, so we're going to start with this image here, which is the lighthouse, and we're going to bring up our color correction tools, right? And in the first video, we talked about creating a workspace, and I'm just going to reset my color workspace to bring up the tools that I like to have working on color, and it's the info panel that I have grouped with the histogram, and then the properties panel that I have grouped with layers. And for this particular exercise, talking about digital fundamentals, I want to add another panel here. So I'm going to move these over just a little bit, and we'll come back and work with these in just a minute. And I want to add the channels panel here, because when we add the channels panel, and notice that you can just click on the channels panel, and then it came up on over my other screen, and I'll just move it over in here. And what this shows you is the building blocks of your images. And that's how Photoshop images are constructed, is out of individual channels. And we look here, and if we look in the channels panel, here's the RGB, which is the composite. And then we have the red, the green, and the blue channel, which is how this image is put together. And notice that there's keyboard shortcuts we can use, and I'm going to use those for the rest of the video. Command on the Mac, Control on Windows, 2 for the RGB composite, and then 3, 4, and 5 to look at the individual channels. So Command 2 shows us the RGB image, and then 3 is the red channel, 4, and then 5 shows us the red, green, and blue channels. So, and as we go through the individual channels, there's something that becomes really obvious right off the bat, is that when we look at the red, the green, and the blue, there's no color on these channels, right? Because RGB color images it's really kind of a misnomer. They're actually made up of nothing but grayscale pixels, right? Let's go back to the composite at Command or Control 2, and then I'm just going to I'm going to zoom in on this red roof here, all right? And it's kind of a dark picture, which we'll come back to in just a minute, but you can kind of see the red in there. And then I want to just toggle through the channels again. There's the composite, and then the red, the green, and the blue. All right, and back to the composite. Let's zoom in just a little bit more so you can actually start to see the pixels. All right. And then the red, the green, and the blue. And look right underneath my cursor here. There's the red. And notice that the image is constructed out of pixels, but it's pixels on 3 channels, and then red, green, and blue. And each of these pixels on every channel is nothing but grayscale. All right? The color that we see, and let's go back to the original dimension and Command 2 to go back to the RGB, the color that we see on screen is the output color, right? What we actually capture and edit when we work in Photoshop is nothing but grayscale. So when we get the grayscale right, then the color is going to be right. And then the actual color that we see on output depends upon what the output device, in this case the monitor, does with those grayscale pixels, or a printer does with the grayscale pixels. And typically on a lot of printers, there's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black output devices, or they may even have more channels. But we work in RGB, so we want to get the grayscale values correct in our color images. So there's the fundamentals of how a color image actually works in Photoshop. And just to show you again, zoom in, look at the 3 channels. There's the composite, the red, the green, and the blue, and it's nothing but grayscale. And the color is actually created on output. In this case, we're looking at the monitor, and the monitor is taking those grayscale pixels in each of the 3 channels and creating the color version based upon the grayscale values of those pixels. Okay, so there's the fundamentals. of our digital image and how we actually capture and create color. Now, let's talk about evaluating these grayscale pixels that we have on all three of these channels. And to do that, and here I'm going to take my channels panel and I'm just going to move it over here to the side because we're going to start looking at these here. And we'll keep our channels panel handy so we can go back to it when we want to take another look at the individual channels. And there's multiple ways we can evaluate these pixels on these grayscale channels. The two ways that we're going to do in this course are one, using histograms, and then we're going to make adjustments based upon those histograms. Then we're going to add in RGB values, actually numeric values. We're going to just dip our toes in that just a little bit here, but we're going to really focus on looking at histograms. And if you've forgotten how to set up your color workspace, just go back to the first video and set up your own workspace. And remember that if things get cattywampus, you just come underneath here, go to workspace, and then reset. See, here's my color workspace. I just choose reset color workspace, and it brings up everything that you see here, minus the channels panel, because I typically don't need that just for performing color correction. All right, so let's take a look at our histograms. First, let's start there. Because histograms are so powerful, these are graphical displays, right? They're semi-quantitative, right? Because we can actually see the data, but they're visual displays of that data. And when we set up our histogram properly, right, when we show all channels and show channels in color, up at the top, we see a combination of all three, the red, the green, and the blue. Now keep in mind, as we just looked at, there isn't really red, green, and blue data here. It's all grayscale, but it's nice to be able to display them as color values just visually. But we'll know in the back of our minds that it's nothing but grayscale. But it's very handy to look at them in color. So this top histogram here is the master histogram. If you were to add the grayscale values of all three, the data of all three of these channels, this is what you end up with. And look how the blue channel is out here, right? And then you add the blue, the green, the red, and you end up, and notice that this peak is higher than any of the individual ones because this is the added version of all three. Right? This peak is a little bit wider than any of these because it's the added version of all three. So this is the tonal distribution from highlight to shadow. All right? And then this is the tonal data on each of the three channels that controls the red, the green, and the blue on output. All right, so looking at the histogram, we can see a couple of things right off the bat here. First, let's do a quick tonal evaluation, although I want to emphasize that when we correct images, we always correct color first and then tone, because color adjusts the distribution of the data on all three channels, and therefore it affects the overall distribution of tone. So we want to do the color first and then fine-tune the tone. But for our evaluation, it makes sense to just start by looking at the tone. Now, a histogram shows data all the way from pure white to pure black. Pure white on the right-hand side, and then pure black, the darkest pixels on the left-hand side. When we look at the distribution of data in this histogram, we can see there's almost no data from white to almost to the midtone. It's about maybe 40%. There's no data at all. All the data in this image is from close to the midtone down to the shadow. And doesn't that coincide with what we visually see in this image? There's not a lot of highlight or even quarter tone data in this image. It's a pretty dark, it's a low-key image. Right? And we see that each of the three channels reflects that same lack of data from highlight to close to midtone, because that's all the data in this image, and this is just a composite view of that. So we see we have a fairly dark image here by just visually, and we see the confirmation of that by looking at the histogram. We see a semi-quantitative display of that. We can see, oh man, there's no data from highlight to midtone. That's why this image is pretty dark, and it's also very low contrast. Right? So that's the first overall evaluation that we make of this image, is the overall tonal distribution. And we can see it very clear in the tone histogram, the master histogram. What else can we see by looking at histogram? That's tone. How about color? Well, one of the really valuable things about histograms in terms of evaluating color, and as we'll see, we can monitor our histograms when we make adjustments, is that when we look at the highlight end of histograms, when we're looking to see, hey, is there a color cast in this image? Always pay attention to the highlight end first, because that almost always gives you a really good indication of the overall distribution of color or the balance of color in the image. And if one of these channels sticks out to the right of the other channels, that's a pretty good indication that that's going to be the color cast in the image. And we look in these three images, these three channels here, the red, the green, and the blue, we see, and let's just, in our mind's eye, let's just draw a line down from the highlight end of the red. Notice that it intersects pretty close to the highlight end of the green, but when we continue that straight line down, look at that. The blue data sticks out to the right pretty visually clearly. So when we see this, and you can tell this, boom, in just an instant, less than a second, you can look at this and goes, my golly, I bet you there's a blue color cast in this image. Now, whether you can see that or not in this image, after you've developed some sense of evaluating color, you're going to be able to visually see that, by golly, there is probably a blue color cast in this image. And when you get used to looking at a lot of images, and this is a gray day, you're going to expect a blue color cast. But when we look at this, we see the semi-quantitative, the graphical evidence of this blue color cast. How could we confirm that? Here's where we're going to dip our toes into the RGB numeric world for just a second. This RGB, this info panel here, and I've got my eyedropper tool, just my basic eyedropper tool selected here. And when I put that over the sky, look at those RGB values. 108, 113, 129. As I move my eyedropper around, 103, 111, 129. If I move it over the lighthouse, that I think maybe that should be white. And look at our values, 82, 84, and 91. Looking at the red, the green, and the blue values. As we move this around our lighthouse that we think should be white, and we see that the red and green values are pretty darn close to each other on the lighthouse, but also on the house itself, 77, 76. All right, we're looking at areas in the image we think should be neutral gray, in this case white, and we can see, by golly, the blue values are indeed greater than the red and the green on just about every area of this image that we think might be close to neutral gray. And that corresponds to and corroborates what we see in the histogram here. All right, so this is how we use histograms and RGB data to evaluate our images. So where we're going to go next, and I'm just going to give you just a quick look-see here to make adjustments of images based upon histograms and then RGB data, is we're going to add something called an adjustment layer. In this case, we're going to use curves adjustment layers. I never use levels because I can do everything in curves I can do with levels and a whole lot more. With curves, I have adjustment that I can do across the entire tonal spectrum. Now, this is a curves adjustment layer that I just need to add that because I just have one layer to adjust here, so I don't have to apply it as a clipping mask. More on that later. But when I bring this up, I can see the composite histogram here in curves. I can also look at the individual channels, right? The red, the green, and the blue, and I see exactly the same data here that I see over here, right? And we see and as we toggle through the red, the green, and the blue, here we're using the Option and the Alt key, we can see how that blue channel is offset to the right, just like it is in the histogram. See the individual channel displays. And let's go back to the composite. And just to dip our toes in an adjustment, watch what happens. I'm just going to make a quick tonal adjustment, and we'll do more of this later. I'm just going to take my highlight end here, and remember, there's no data from highlight to midtone or just close to midtone. And I'm just going to make this adjustment. Watch what happens to the image, but also watch what happens to the histograms. As I take this highlight slider and I move it over to here, notice how that image gets much, much brighter. And also look at the histograms. Notice how that they are spread out now across the tonal range. Right? So you get real-time adjustments of both the image and the alterations of the histogram. And now, when we zoom in, like on our roof, right, and we look at the red, let's click on our layer, and we look at the composite, and then the red, the green, and the blue, we can see much greater differences, right, in the tonal values now that we've lightened up the image. So there's the composite, there's the red, there's the green, and there's the blue. And then Command or Control 0 to go back to our full screen view, and Command 2. All right. The keyboard shortcuts for looking at the individual channels on the channel panel are a little bit different than the keyboard shortcuts for looking at channels when we're looking at displaying the channels on a curves adjustment layer. They're Option or Alt, and then 3, 4 and 5, as opposed to Command 3, 4, and 5 when we're working with the channels. Just something to get used to. But you can always manually go to these and choose the channels or the master channel that you want to look at. So that's how we evaluate an image, and we just did a quick tonal adjustment just to introduce the concept of using adjustment layers and see how the image and the histogram adjust to adjustments in tonal layers. And remember that all this is completely non-destructive. I can turn this adjustment layer off and on. It shows you before and after. I can do that down here, where I can return the image to the original if I want to. I can actually throw this channel away if I want to. Throw the adjustment layer away. Completely non-destructive editing. All right. So there we go. Just to review now, just to go back. Our image is made up of 3 grayscale channels. All right. And the grayscale channels are the red, the green, and the blue. What we see on screen is the composite RGB. And that's on the RGB value to create an output, in this case, by your monitor. And our job when we're evaluating the image using histogram, bring up the histogram panel, look at the distribution of tone, look to see if we have any color sticking out on one end or another. And maybe sometimes more than one color sticks out. Maybe there's a complex color cast to an image. This was a fairly straightforward blue color cast. All right? And we corroborated that by looking at the RGB values. We just dipped our toe in the RGB numeric world a little bit. And then we added an adjustment layer, which is non-destructive editing, to our image. So now you get a really good sense for how we're going to use histograms and a little bit of RGB values to help us evaluate our images, and use adjustment layers to help adjust the tone and then later on color.